Psychology and sex. What we know about the psychology of sex across a number of different areas: sexuality, sexual orientation, identity, and attraction. The sex act? Or sexual intercourse, sexual practices and relationships, and what has recently been called the sexualization of culture. Each chapter links to various books and papers which you can read to find more about topics you're interested in. They also given you a list of further resources at the end of the book where you can go to get more information about all of the topics I have covered. But before we get started on these specific topics, let's think a bit more generally about these words we reusing: psychology and sex. You might think that it's obvious what they mean, but actually they are both rather contested terms. In fact, I hope that throughout every chapter of this book you continue to ask yourself, what is psychology? And what is sex? And that the answers that you give will change as you go along. As with many of the best questions, there are no right answers to these ones, but rather it's important and useful to continually ask them, and to notice how your answers shift as you reflect on them more. What is psychology? The British Psychological Society, American Psychological Association, and other similar organizations tend to define psychology as something like the scientific study of mind and behavior. From this we might understand psychology to be psychology, sex, excerpted from the Psychology of Sex chapter 549, in this case devoted to researching people's mental processes, mind, and how they act in the world, behavior. The word scientific might make us think of lab coats, experiments, and measuring these things in objective ways using numbers. The narrow view certainly for much of its history, psychology has been strongly invested in proving itself to be a science alongside other natural sciences like biology and physics. Students frequently choose a psychology degree because they interested in people, would like to understand themselves better, or want to help people. So they often surprised? And not always pleasantly so? By how much of the time they spend learning about mathematical statistics and brain processes. A lot of the classic kinds of studies that psychologists conduct do seem to support this fairly narrow definition of psychology as the science of mind and behavior. For example, you might be familiar with the kinds of memory tests that psychologists perform by flashing words up on a computer screen and measuring how many people can remember, examining whether the kind of word, or its place in the list, has an influence on how well it is remembered. Or you may know about Stanley Milgram's classic studies on obedience, where he got people in a lab to think that they were giving somebody gradually increasing electric shocks to help them learn. He found that many people would give somebody a fatal electric shock if somebody in a lab coat told them to do so. Those are two examples of the scientific study of mind, memory, and behavior, obedience to authority. They've now been working in psychology for over 20 years. They've been part of several different psychology departments and have many different psychologist friends and colleagues. What they learned from them is that psychology is actually a good deal broader than what we might at first understand from a definition like the scientific study of mind and behavior. The broad view at its best, I think that psychology is the place where all the work which is relevant to our individual human experience comes together. It's a broad, encompassing discipline which draws together all the knowledge that we have which is relevant to people, and which also looks outwards to address how we can improve people's lives. I have psychologist friends whose work is between psychology and history, psychology and geography, psychology and endocrinology, psychology and sociology, psychology and philosophy, psychology and neuroscience, psychology psychology, sex, excerpted from the Psychology of Sex chapter 550, and criminology, psychology and drama, and many, many more. In fact, I know of relatively few pure psychologists. Most study psychology as it touches the edge of at least one other discipline, whether a natural science, a social science, or an arts or humanities subject. Relatively few of these psychologists conduct lab experiments. Some are entirely engaged with developing theories, others study human behavior in real-world settings, or interview people in depth about their experiences, or study the history of psychological thinking, or use creative methods to help people produce something that is somewhere between research data and art. Most of them also apply psychological research and theories in some way, informing, for example, the worlds of law, medicine, social justice, counseling, media, or the environment. Some of them work entirely in an applied context, providing therapy, advising organizations, catching criminals, or helping kids in school, for example. The psychology aspects turning to the subject of this book? Or any of the other books in this series? You can see why this broad understanding of psychology is important. Sex is a fascinating, far-reaching, and fraught area of human experience. We could limit ourselves to a narrow view of the psychology of sex and just focus on what we can learn about how people think and behave sexually, from experiments and questionnaires, for example. However, to really reach an understanding of how sex works, how people experience it, and what they think and feel about it, it is important to draw on knowledge from across a wide range of disciplines in conjunction with psychology. We need to know the history of how people, including psychologists, have understood sex and sexuality, and how that affects how we understand it today. We need to know about the physiology of sex and how different bodies and brains respond sexually. We need to look at sexual identities and practices across cultures and contexts, and at the development of sexual communities and social movements. We need to draw on the wealth of theories that have developed in various branches of philosophy to understand sexuality and sexual relationships. We certainly need to bring the discipline of psychology together with biology and sociology, given that human beings are biological bodies and they all exist in a social context, shaping how they think and behave sexually. And we absolutely need to study the work of the sexologists? People who have studied sex and sexuality specifically over the years. Some but not all of whom are psychologists. Psychology is political. One debate that hasn't stopped raging in psychology since the 1970s is whether psychology can be neutral and objective, or whether it is inevitably political. In other words, whether psychologists will have individual and cultural biases which influence what they study, how they study it, and what they find. This is a vital issue for our purposes here because it influences how I write the rest of this book. And how you read it. Can I present you with a range of research findings and theories from psychology? In its broadest sense? So you can go away with the facts about the psychology of sex? Or will we both need to keep reminding ourselves about how all of the studies and theories we recovering were produced by certain individuals in a certain time and place? Perhaps seeing these findings and ideas as one way of understanding the psychology of sex, but not as any kind of absolute fact? Psychologists have often divided into two factions around these kinds of issues. The first faction we might call mainstream psychologists, for want of a better word, those who believe that it is possible for psychology to conduct objective value-free research to determine facts about human minds and behavior. The latter faction are often called critical psychologists. Those who believe that psychological knowledge always develops in a specific situation which will affect what psychologists find and what they do with it.